What happens when classmates become the source of unimaginable pain? This is the heartbreaking story of how boys turned against their own classmates, unleashing a night of unimaginable terror. Enraged by the girls' refusal to join their strike, the boys stormed the girls' dormitories, unleashing horrific violence, including physical and sexual assaults. The chaos resulted in some girls losing their lives and others suffering severe injuries, leaving a community shattered. But from the darkness, one girl's courage sparked hope and change. Watch till the end to honor her story. Share to spread the message, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stand against violence. The sun rose over the small village of Mugoha, casting golden rays over the rocky hills and dusty paths. For 15-year-old Eshe, this morning marked the beginning of her dreams. She stood outside her family's humble homestead, clutching a faded bag filled with second-hand books and a uniform stitched together by her mother. Today, she was leaving for Nayando Secondary School, the only mixed boarding school in the region. Eshe's heart was full of hope, but her journey here had been anything but easy. Born to a struggling family of subsistence farmers, she had grown up in a world of droughts, failed harvests, and the constant hum of survival. Her mother often said, "Eshe, a girl's life is like climbing a steep mountain, but if you keep climbing, you'll see the sky." Eshe clung to those words through every challenge, especially when her father hesitated to send her to school, believing a girl belonged in the kitchen, not the classroom. Eshe's determination set her apart from her peers. By the light of a flickering lantern, she would study late into the night, her eyes burning, but her spirit unyielding. Her teacher, an elderly man named Mwalimu Kali, believed she was destined for greatness. "Eshe," he had said, after she topped her primary school exams, "you have the mind of a river. It carves through stone, unstoppable." Yet, the reality of poverty loomed large. Her mother sold the family's only chicken to buy her school uniform, while her younger brother, Tajiri, chipped in by working odd jobs in the village. When Eshe finally secured a spot at Nayando Secondary, it felt like a miracle. Her parents saw her off with quiet pride, her mother slipping a beaded charm bracelet onto her wrist. "For protection," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Nayando Secondary School stood at the edge of a vast savanna, its worn-out buildings surrounded by acacia trees. Eshe arrived at midday, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She noticed the sharp contrast between the boys, who moved with loud confidence, and the girls, many of whom kept to themselves, their eyes downcast. Eshe quickly befriended her bunkmate, Zawina, a soft-spoken girl with a ready smile. They spent their first few days exploring the school, laughing over shared dreams of becoming teachers or doctors. The classrooms buzzed with activity, and despite the chipped desks and squeaky chalkboards, Eshe felt alive with purpose. But not everything at Nayando was as it seemed. The boys, led by a tall, cocky senior named Basara, had an air of entitlement that unsettled Eshe. They strutted around the compound, often cutting in line during meals or mocking the younger students. "Don't mind them," Zawina told her one evening. "They're all bark and no bite." At night, Eshe would sit on her bed staring out the small window at the stars. She thought of her family, of Tajiri's laughter, of her parents' tired smiles. She swore to herself she would make them proud. One afternoon, the head teacher, Mr. Lugembe, called for an emergency assembly. His stern face was set in deep lines as he announced that Nayando Secondary would not be participating in the upcoming regional athletics meet due to insufficient funding. The news fell like a thunderclap. For the boys, The athletics meet was the highlight of the year, a chance to show off their prowess and win glory for the school. Basara, a celebrated sprinter, stood abruptly. "This is unacceptable," he shouted, his voice ringing out across the assembly hall. "How can you deny us this opportunity? This is what we've trained for all year." The murmurs among the boys turned into a loud roar of discontent, but while the boys protested, the girls remained calm. Eshe and Zawena exchanged uneasy glances as the tension in the room escalated. The head teacher's attempts to restore order were drowned out by the boys' shouts of defiance. "They're behaving like wild animals," Zawena muttered as they walked back to the dormitory. "It's just a competition." Eshe nodded, but felt a knot tightening in her stomach. The boys weren't letting this go. That evening, rumors spread like wildfire through the dormitories. Basara and his friends were planning a boycott of classes until the decision was reversed. By the next day, the boys made good on their threats. They gathered in the courtyard shouting slogans and disrupting lessons. "No meat! No school!" Basara led the chant, his voice booming. The girls, however, remained steadfast, refusing to join the fracas. "It's pointless," Eshe said to Zawena during their lunch break. "The head teacher already explained there's no money." "But they're angry," Zawena replied, her voice tinged with worry. "And when boys are angry, bad things happen." The girls' refusal to participate in the protest only seemed to stoke the boys' resentment. By nightfall, the mood in the school had grown darker. Eshe overheard snippets of conversation as she walked back to the dormitory. "They think they're better than us," one boy hissed. "They're traitors," another spat. Eshe clenched her fists, her heart heavy with unease. Back in the dormitory, the girls huddled together, whispering nervously. Coco, a senior girl with a commanding presence, tried to reassure them. "They're just blowing off steam," she said. "It'll pass." But Eshe wasn't so sure. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, she lay awake, clutching the charm bracelet her mother had given her. Somewhere in the distance, she heard faint laughter, low and sinister. A sense of foreboding settled over her like a shroud. As the clock struck midnight, the faint sound of footsteps echoed outside the dormitory. They paused, then moved closer, stopping just beyond the door. "Did you hear that?" Zawena whispered, her voice barely audible. Eshe nodded, her heart pounding. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were alive. The footsteps retreated, leaving behind an eerie silence. But Eshe knew. This was only the beginning. Something bad was coming. And it was coming soon. The morning broke heavy with tension, the golden rays of the savannah muted by clouds that clung to the horizon. At Nayando Secondary School, the usual hum of students preparing for the day was replaced by an uneasy quiet. The boys, who had spent the night fuming over their frustrations, were eerily silent. Eshe felt it first, a sense of foreboding that settled over the compound like a storm cloud. She tightened the knot on her faded scarf and glanced at Zawena, who sat beside her in the dining hall, poking at her porridge with a spoon. "They're planning something," Eshe said softly, her voice taut. Zawena nodded but said nothing. The dormitory whispers of the previous night lingered in her mind like shadows. She had overheard a senior boy, Kyondo, muttering to his friends about teaching the girls a lesson. "If they won't stand with us," he had said, "they'll regret it." The warning signs appeared before breakfast ended. A group of boys stood at the edge of the dining hall, their eyes locked on the girls. Basara, the leader of the strike, leaned against the wall with a smirk that sent a chill down Isha's spine. When the girls rose to leave, the boys blocked their path. "Not so fast," Basara said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We need to have a little chat." "We have nothing to say to you," said Coco, stepping forward with her chin raised high. As the senior girl, she had always been a source of strength for the younger students. Basara's smirk widened. You think you're better than us? Sitting there with your books while we fight for the school's honor? Eshi's heart pounded as the boys closed in. The head teacher, Mr. Lugembe, suddenly appeared in the doorway, his presence scattering the boys like startled birds. Enough of this nonsense, he bellowed. Back to your dorms, all of you. The boys retreated, but not before Basara shot a parting glance at the girls. This isn't over, he muttered. By midday, the boys' anger had reached a boiling point. They stormed through the school compound, banging on doors, toppling desks, and shouting slogans. The girls, huddled in their classrooms, tried to focus on their lessons, but the noise was impossible to ignore. The tipping point came during lunch. A group of boys burst into the girls' dining hall, their faces twisted with rage. They began flipping over tables, scattering food across the floor. Why are you just sitting here? One boy shouted. Are you too good to stand with us? The girls screamed as the boys lunged at them, snatching plates and pulling at their scarves. Eshi clutched Zawina's hand, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She wanted to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground. Then Coco stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the chaos. Leave us alone, she shouted. But Basara wasn't listening. He grabbed a pitcher of water and dumped it over Coco's head, laughing cruelly. You're nothing but cowards, he sneered, all of you. The boys left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving behind overturned furniture, shattered plates, and terrified girls. That night, the girls locked themselves in their dormitory, barricading the door with desks and chairs. The matron, Mama Mukiri, had tried to intervene earlier, but had been shouted down by the boys, who roamed the compound unchecked. Eshe sat on her bunk, clutching her mother's charm bracelet and staring at the makeshift barricade. Do you think they'll come back? She asked Zawina, her voice trembling. They're boys, not monsters, Zawina replied, but her tone lacked conviction. The wind howled outside, rattling the tin roof. Around midnight, the sound of footsteps approached. The girls froze, their breaths shallow. The footsteps stopped outside the door, followed by a loud bang that echoed through the dormitory. Come out, cowards! Basara's voice rang out, laced with anger. You think you can hide? The banging continued, louder and more forceful. The girls huddled together, some crying softly, others whispering prayers. Eshi clenched her fists, anger welling up inside her. How could the boys do this? Didn't they understand the sacrifices the girls had made to be here, the struggles they had endured? Eshi thought of her mother, who had given up so much to send her to school, and of her father, who had finally come around, believing in her potential. She thought of Tajiri, her younger brother, who had always looked up to her. She had promised them all that she would rise above the challenges, but now, trapped in the darkness of the dormitory, she felt helpless. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. The girls waited, their hearts pounding as the shadows outside the window seemed to thicken. Eshi whispered a silent plea. Please, let this end. Please, let us be safe. Morning came, but the tension remained. The head teacher called for a school-wide assembly, his face etched with worry. This behavior will not be tolerated, he said, his voice cracking. The school is on the brink of closure if this continues. The girls listened in silence, but the boys jeered and laughed, their defiance unbroken. Basara, standing at the back of the crowd, locked eyes with Aisha and smirked. As the students were dismissed, Aisha felt a chill run down her spine. The boys weren't finished, and she knew it. Something darker was brewing, something that would test them all in ways they couldn't imagine. That night, as the girls prepared for bed, Eshi glanced out the window and saw shadows moving in the courtyard. She squinted, her breath catching. The boys were gathered in a circle, their voices low and urgent. "What are they doing?" Zawena whispered, joining her at the window. "I don't know," Eshi replied, fear curling in her stomach. But one thing was clear, they were planning something. And this time, it wouldn't just be banging on doors or flipping tables. In the distance, a lone owl hooted, its mournful cry echoing in the night. Eshi clutched her charm bracelet and whispered a prayer. The night felt unnaturally still, the wind absent and the silence heavy as if the school itself held its breath. In the girls' dormitory, the air was thick with fear. Eshi sat cross-legged on her bunk, staring out the small window at the shadows shifting in the courtyard below. The boys had remained there for hours, their murmurs rising and falling like the tide. "What are they planning?" Zawena whispered, her voice trembling. Eshi shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had never felt so helpless, so exposed. Even Coco, who usually exuded calm authority, seemed on edge, pacing the dormitory and muttering to herself. Coco shook her head, her face grim. "This isn't just scare tactics anymore. They're out for blood." Outside, the boys' shouting grew louder, their insults sharper. They taunted the girls, calling them cowards, traitors, and worse. Basara's voice rose above the rest, dripping with venom. "They think they're too good for us," he sneered. "Let's see if they still feel that way after tonight." The girls pressed themselves against the walls as the first rocks struck the windows, shattering the glass and sending shards flying across the room. Then came the pounding on the door, the wood groaning under the force of the blows. "Open up!" Basara bellowed, "or we'll tear this place down!" The door held for only a few moments. With a deafening crash, it gave way, splintering into pieces as the boys surged inside. Their faces were twisted with rage, their eyes wild with an unsettling mix of anger and exhilaration. The girls screamed, scattering like frightened birds, but there was nowhere to go. The dormitory was small and cramped, the beds and trunks offering little protection. Eshi tried to stay hidden, crouching behind her bed with Zawena beside her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She could hear the chaos unfolding around her, the sound of beds being overturned, girls crying out in pain, and the boys' cruel laughter. "Found one!" a voice shouted, followed by a piercing scream. Eshi's stomach churned as she realized what was happening. Basara strode through the room like a conqueror, grabbing at girls who tried to run past him. "You thought you could defy us?" he roared. "This is what you get!" The violence escalated quickly, spiraling out of control. The boys' anger gave way to something darker, something primal. They tore at the girls' clothes, dragging them from their hiding places, ignoring their cries and pleas. Eshi clutched Zawena's hand, her nails digging into her friend's skin. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll see us." But Zawena's sobs grew louder, her fear too overwhelming to contain. Before Esha could stop her, Zawena bolted, trying to make a run for the door. She didn't make it far. Two boys caught her, grabbing her by the arms and dragging her to the center of the room. "No!" Eshi cried, standing up without thinking. She froze as Basara turned toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Well, look who we have here," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The little hero." Eshi backed away, her legs trembling. "Leave her alone," she said, her voice barely audible. Basara laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Or what?" He grabbed Zawena by the hair, forcing her to her knees. "You think you can stop us?" Before Eshi could respond, a group of boys rushed toward her, pinning her against the wall. She struggled, but their grip was too strong. The room descended into chaos. The younger girls were trampled in the panic, their screams drowned out by the noise. The dormitory, already overcrowded, became a death trap as the boys shoved and pushed, fighting to assert their dominance. Some of the girls tried to escape through the broken windows, cutting themselves on the jagged glass in their desperation. Others hid under the beds, their hands clasped over their mouths to stifle their sobs. But there was no escape. Ishi's world became a blur of pain and fear. She heard Zawina's cries, sharp and piercing, and the sound of someone pounding on the walls, begging for help. The air grew thick, suffocating, as bodies pressed against each other in the chaos. By the time the teachers arrived, it was too late. The boys had fled, their laughter fading into the night as they disappeared into the shadows. Inside the dormitory, the scene was one of devastation. Broken furniture and shattered glass littered the floor, mingling with blood and the torn remnants of clothing. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and smoke from a fire that had nearly consumed the building. Eshi lay on the floor, her body bruised and battered, her mind struggling to process what had happened. Around her, the other girls sobbed or stared blankly at the walls, their eyes hollow with shock. Zawena was nowhere to be seen. As the teachers moved through the room trying to tend to the injured, they began to grasp the full extent of the tragedy. 19 girls were dead, their bodies trampled or suffocated in the chaos. 71 others were injured, their wounds a stark testament to the night's horrors. Eshi felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Mr. Lugembe, his face pale and drawn. "You're safe now," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Eshi knew the truth. They weren't safe. Not here, not anywhere. The compound was eerily quiet the morning after the rampage. The chaos of the night had given way to a suffocating stillness, broken only by the sound of muffled sobs and whispers. For Esha, it felt like waking up into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The dormitory was unrecognizable, the beds were overturned, the floors smeared with blood and mud. Torn clothes and broken personal items littered the space, a grim reminder of the night's horrors. And then there were the bodies, lifeless and still, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Eshi sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't moved since the teachers had found her hours ago, her body too numb to respond. Beside her, Coco held Zawina's rosary in her hands, her thumb rubbing the beads methodically, though her lips were silent. "They're gone," Coco whispered, her voice trembling. "Zawina, Amani, even little Tumaini, they're all gone." Eshi closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry, but the tears came anyway. Zawina's laugh echoed in her memory, bright and full of hope. Now, that hope was gone, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The school administrators gathered the girls in the assembly hall later that morning. Eshi's legs felt heavy as she walked there, every step dragging her closer to the full realization of what had happened. The head teacher, Mr. Lugembe, stood at the front of the room, his face pale but composed. Behind him, a line of teachers stood awkwardly, avoiding eye contact with the girls. "We understand the events of last night were unfortunate," Mr. Lugembe began, his voice devoid of emotion. "We are conducting an investigation, and those responsible will be held accountable." The words rang hollow. The girls exchanged looks of disbelief and anger. Eshi clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Unfortunate? That was all he had to say about the lives lost, the girls violated, the dreams destroyed. "They killed Zawena!" Coco shouted, her voice cracking. "They raped Mariamu! How can you stand there and call this unfortunate?" The hall erupted with murmurs of agreement, but Mr. Lugembe raised his hand for silence. I understand your grief, but we must remain calm. The authorities will handle this matter. Eshi felt a surge of rage. And what about us? She demanded, her voice shaking. What happens to the girls who are still alive? Who will help us? Mr. Lugembe's eyes flickered with discomfort. The school will be closed indefinitely while we address these issues. You'll all be sent home to recover with your families. By noon, buses lined the school driveway, ready to take the students back to their villages. The girls boarded in silence, their faces drawn and pale. Eshi sat by the window, clutching her trunk and staring out at the barren schoolyard. The boys' dormitory stood in the distance, its windows dark and empty. There were no signs of remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. Coco sat beside her, her gaze distant. Do you think they'll be punished? She asked quietly. Eshi shook her head. Not properly. They'll say it was a mistake, that they were just boys being boys. Coco's jaw tightened. And we're supposed to just live with it? Eshi didn't answer. She didn't have the strength to. Her thoughts were consumed by what awaited her back in the village. How would she explain this to her mother? How could she face the shame, the whispers, the pity? Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the first episode of Shadows of Nayando. Your support and engagement mean the world to us, and we're so grateful to have shared this powerful story with you. As the girls leave the school, carrying with them the weight of their experiences, questions linger. Will justice be served for what happened at Nayando Secondary? How will Eshe, Coco, and the others rebuild their lives? And can the bonds they share endure the trials ahead? The story is far from over, and the next chapter promises even more revelations, struggles, and hope. Don't miss what's to come. If you've been moved by this episode, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who care about powerful stories of resilience and courage. Together, we can keep the conversation alive. Stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next episode of Shadows of Nayando.